Alexei Navalny. Now, Alexei Navalny's mother has been unable to recover his body after his death in an Arctic jail. This is from a close aide to the dead Russian opposition leader. His poor mother was told the body would be handed over once a post-mortem examination had been completed. Now, Navalny's team believe that he was murdered on the orders of Vladimir Putin. 300 Russians or thereabouts have been arrested for laying tributes. Western governments have been quick to condemn this, saying the blame lies with Russian authorities for the 47-year-old's sudden death. Foreign ministers from the G7 called on Russia to urgently clarify the circumstances surrounding it. Now, also, we heard this terrible story about the mother travelling to try and to retrieve her son's body, only to find that actually the mortuary was closed and she hasn't been allowed to see it. This comes also on the back of a press release from the Home Office, which I was given yesterday. The Home Office has announced that we are approaching 2 years since the barbaric Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians who have been welcomed into this country are now going to be eligible to stay for an additional 18 months. There are 283,000 Ukrainians now in the United Kingdom. More than 11 billion of military, humanitarian and economic support has also been given. Well, joining us now is Dr. Stephen Hall, who's an author and lecturer in Russian politics at the University of Bath. Good morning to you.
Good morning, David.
Really good to talk to you. I mean, this is a really shocking story. I was actually watching the interview with Navalny, which was recorded back in 2017, where he talked about his fears and why he was standing. And of course, he was very feared by the Kremlin because he was the major opposition to Putin.
Well, certainly he was the main opposition because of the way the political system works in Russia, that you have systemic opposition parties who are allowed to stand in the elections. Navalny was never really allowed to stand in any elections, 2013, the Moscow mayoral election being the exception there. But he was certainly the main opposition in a hegemonic autocracy. He was able to develop a network across Russia that had never occurred before. So whilst he maybe didn't have the support of an awful lot of Russians, he certainly was the opposition to Putin.
So what do you make of this? Because obviously you can see the pictures there of him smiling and joking, looking in quite good health. This was just a few days before. Now, apparently, the prison service told his mother he died on Friday after collapsing and falling unconscious during a walk outside. And the condition given was sudden death syndrome, which I'm not entirely sure is a very good diagnosis. It's a very broad diagnosis indeed, and Russia's foreign ministry said it rejected biased and unrealistic assessments over the cause of death.
Well, yes, I mean, this is one of the many narratives that the Kremlin has been out promoting. They originally said that it was a blood clot. I'm not a medical doctor, but as far as I'm aware, in order to confirm a blood clot, you need to do an autopsy. They haven't done one yet. The sudden death syndrome came out as well, which sounds very strange. And of course, the other one was that the CIA managed to get to him in a prison in the north of Russia that was heavily securitized, and he was surrounded by security guards, but the CIA and MI6 somehow managed to get in there and do away with him. And another narrative was that his lawyer was the one that poisoned him. So this is what the Kremlin does. It promotes disinformation. It's going to have lots of different stories. We'll never get to the truth, at least coming from the Russian authorities. Who knows what Navalny died of, but certainly all roads, I think, lead to Putin. I'm not saying Putin obviously did it himself, but I can imagine that he gave an order, or at least agreed to someone saying, let's do away with Navalny.
And certainly there are pictures. He was greeting a group of students, and of course he was grinning away when we knew the news about Navalny. Talking about disinformation, you see, they've now issued a statement saying that the initial post-mortem examination was inconclusive and a second post-mortem would be carried out. So one moment we're being told he hadn't had a post-mortem, now we're being told that there is one, but it was inconclusive, and now we need another one. Obfuscation.
It is a fustication. You know, that's the reason why they're not giving up the body, apparently, because they need to have a second post-mortem. They need to find out what it was that killed him, which again points to how they already knew about the blood clot, but that's by the by. This is, I think, to hide the traces of how he was done away with, effectively. I suspect also that the funeral for Navalny won't happen until after the presidential elections, because we've seen that there were, you said 300 people have been arrested. It's between 300 and 400. There were protests in 140 Russian cities. So they don't want to bring a lot of people out onto the streets, and Navalny, at least in death, has that potential to do that.
And of course, you mentioned the elections. I believe they're next month, and Putin has had quite a run, hasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He's had quite a run. The presidential administration, were under the impression that they needed to show an opposition, as it were, to Putin, that they would have an anti-war candidate. And I think this was a way for them to gauge how many Russians were against the war. What they didn't realize was that a lot of Russians are against the war, and we can see in terms of the signing up for Boris Nadezhdin, the anti-war candidate, many Russians queuing in the streets in the snow, in minus 15 weather conditions, just to sign up to allow him to run. And the Kremlin got scared, and he's now been denied access to the presidential election. It is going to be Putin versus the systemic opposition, and we know the result pretty much before it's come out.
I was also watching some interviews with young people, and they were visibly moved, actually, by his death. And I just wondered what your thoughts are in the younger generation. Is there a sense that actually attitudes are changing in that younger generation? And does that mean there'll be change in the future?
I would love to see that there'll be change in the future in Russia, and that's something that I'm advocating. But we need to start talking about a future for Russia, as much as we need to start doing more for Ukraine. But I am reticent in terms of the youth in Russia. What the Kremlin is trying to do in terms of creating a youth army of 1 million strong, what it's trying to do in terms of propagandizing in schools, it is quite worrying as to what is happening for younger Russians. Time will tell in terms of whether they truly believe what they're being taught at school or not, but it is certainly frightening as to what may be coming.
Mm. And in terms of the rhetoric coming from the West at the Munich Security Conference, Lord Cameron, British Foreign Secretary, said the UK would be taking action. Now, I don't know what that action would entail, because I thought we'd pretty much applied all the sanctions we possibly could.
There is still more sanctions that can be done, but hopefully Navalny's death will be beneficial in terms of bringing, again, re-engaging Western governments and Western politicians in support of Ukraine, because Ukraine has to win this war as quickly as possible. This is the only way it can be done. And Navalny's death will highlight again and again, and if we ever needed such an example, that the Putin regime is highly autocratic, highly repressive, and will stop at nothing. And this is why Ukraine needs to be supported to win this war as quickly as possible.
And do you think this will galvanise the United States? Of course, that $91 billion package of aid still being fought over, of course, came from the Senate, now in the House of Representatives. Do you think that actually it will concentrate and focus minds?
I'm ever optimistic about this. You know, I hope this is certainly going to be the case. Joe Biden famously said that if Navalny dies in prison, Putin will pay. So now actions need to speak louder than words. We don't know what the Republican Party is thinking. Certainly, we're in the middle of an election campaign. But I would like to think that the death of the main opposition leader in Russia is enough to galvanize the Republicans into supporting aid for Ukraine.